So, hi everyone, and welcome to what I think is lecture 11 in our Great Explorers course, which is, by the way, one before the last lecture in the course. And first of all, I'm glad to say that there's a new street in Herzliya that about a week ago was named Alan Turing Street. And this morning I had the pleasure to go through it. And also I noticed that there's a very nice intersection today of Alan Turing and the Yeshayahu Leibovich streets. So when you see this street sign, maybe there's hope after all. So it's with this positive spirit that we will start today's lecture about Jewish explorations. And I'd like to dedicate this lecture to my grandfather, Salmon Shoken, who more than 100 years ago has commissioned Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig to develop the first modern German translation of the Bible, a project that lasted about 20 years. But in 1925, the first books began to come out. And this was actually the first modern translation of the Bible, because up until then, the Bible was translated only to Latin, and there was also the King James translation, which was arcane English, which was very difficult to understand. And hold on a minute. And a few years later, he commissioned Everett Fox, an American professor, to develop yet another translation into English, which became the most widely used, the most authoritative translation of the Bible to the English language, up until only about 3 years ago, when another translation of English, of the Bible into English was made by Professor Alter from University of California, which is really a masterpiece. Well, both Everett Fox and the Alter translations are fantastic creations. And all the quotes that you will see in today's lecture, and there are many of them, are taken from the Shoken Bible, translated by Everett Fox. Salman also had an incredible collection of original Jewish manuscripts, and altogether his library had more than 60,000 books. And he also started a little newspaper called Haaretz about 8 years ago. So this lecture, like all lectures in this course, I try to cover a lot of ground in a very limited time frame. And I'm going to say a few words about every one of these periods before Judaism, the ancient world, the paganic world that preceded the invention of Judaism up until about 4,000 years ago. And then I will talk a little bit about Abraham's journey, about the Exodus from Egypt to what we call today the land of Israel, about the King David era, and finally about the prophets. And in doing so, I'm going to almost completely ignore religious belief. Well, I guess I'm going to talk about religious belief, but in a very abstract way. And I'm not interested in historical consistency and in accurate facts. All I want to do in this lecture is try to share with you my own interpretation of the Jewish spirit, how it's related to the historical development of the Jewish religion. This is a course about exploration. So we'll talk about exploration of ideas and how they evolved from proto-Judaism up to roughly the period of the prophets. And of course, I'm going to talk about impact on Western civilization as we know it today, and about innovation. And if you think about it, the three most influential people or intellectuals in the 20th century were Jewish. Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein. And Herzl, of course, also was a great innovator, not only on the Jewish state, but on the idea of the Jewish state and Israel that had a great impact on the 20th century that lasts until today. And so it's not a coincidence that I'm going to focus on innovation, but in this case, it's more like innovative ideas that had a great impact on modern life, modern thinking. Now, it's impossible to understand the importance of Judaism if you don't first connect to what preceded Judaism. And what preceded Judaism was a set of great cultures in the ancient world, which had a common denominator. And this common denominator can be called crudely the wheel of life. And if you look at Sumer, Mesopotamia, everything was believed to be plotted in advance. Life and death progressed in internal predictability. And in Egypt, we saw this tradition of authoritative regime, also authoritative regime of thoughts. Copy your ancestors, follow what has been said in the past. This will set you a good example. And if we look at Greek mortals who dared to struggle and challenge with the gods, they typically ended up with terrible punishments. Prometheus, for example, for stealing fire from the gods and bringing them to humankind. If you look at India, then once again, you see a very similar fatalistic state of mind. Earthly journeys are meaningless. You reach eternity by mentally escaping the present. Do not journey, stay where you are, compose yourself by the river of life. Meditate on its endless and meaningless flow until you come to peace with your destiny and the destiny of all things. So, the ultimate objective is to turn into a rock and just sit there and become part of the surrounding. And the bottom line, so to speak, is do not overreach. We are all bystanders of the great wheel of life, the great wheel which is turned by the gods. And it is no coincidence that these cultures developed near great rivers. In India, it's the Ganges and other great rivers. And in the what today we call the Middle East, we see the great Sumerian empire developing in what was called Mesopotamia, around the rivers, which in Hebrew we call Prat and Chidekel. In English, it's the Euphrates and the Tigris. And then in Egypt, we see the great Egyptian empire developing around the Nile, the delta of the Nile, the Nilus. And, this area was called the Fertile Crescent because it was located like some kind of a jewel, which was located in the middle of a great desert. And geographically, it formed the shape of a crescent, or in Hebrew, Sahel, and it was extremely fertile. And this was the birthplace of agriculture, of commerce, of government, of writing, math, wheel, law. Think about Hammurabi. We talked about number bases last lecture or the lecture before the last, and I told you that the decimal system was the leading system, but in fact the first system that we know of was actually based on the number 12. That's why we have 60 seconds in an hour or in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour until today. That's because the Sumerians and the Babylonians used the 12 base system, because basically they counted their knuckles. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 60, and then finally 60, okay? So that's why up until today, we're stuck with a 60-minute hour and not with a 100-minute hour, which would make much more sense. So, and there's no wonder that these old religions were so fatalistic, because they were completely dependent on the river. And the river, on the one hand, was very predictable. And on the other hand, there were all sorts of catastrophes every once in a while, where there would be a flash flood or locust. And so predictability was the normal state of affair, and which led to fatalism and to sort of cyclical state of mind. And the surprising problems that happened, the fatalities that happened every once in a while, like the floods and the locust and the plagues, were considered the result of fights between the gods. So gods would fight and mankind would suffer, or at least some of mankind. Very similar to the Greek culture as well, where there were hundreds of gods fighting each other. So this was the bedrock of Judaism. That's where everything started. And it all started here in a city called Ur Kasdim, which still exists until today. It's a much smaller and remote city called Ur. But back then it was a spectacular city. It was one of the greatest cities in the world. And today it looks like this, but it was a very modern city surrounded by a moat, as you can see here. And this was a sophisticated city where, once again, there was commerce, there was law, there was science, there was art, and there was always a great sort of tension or conflict between the dwellers of the city and the nomads, the Bedouins, what we call today the Bedouins, who lived outside the walls. And people in the city always looked down at the people, literally speaking, they looked down, over the walls to the savages who lived outside the city. Also in Jerusalem, think about Gay Ben Hinnom, which was another sort of synonym to savage life in the Jewish tradition. And so at some point, about 4,000 years ago, the family of Terach, father of Abraham, decides to leave Ur Kasdim, for reasons that nobody understands, and wander west. And this is a migration in the wrong direction. I think that the word Urbani comes from the sons of Ur, Bnei Ur. And this was a migration from the protected city into the unknown desert. A migration from predictability to adventure. It was a regression to simpler roots, and we don't really understand why exactly they did it. We know that they didn't flee because they took tremendous wealth with them. They took servants and cattle and all sorts of possessions. So this was not a hasty departure. This was sort of pre-planned, and it's still a mystery why they decided to leave, but leave they did. And this led to a very long and arduous exodus or epic journey from what today is Iraq all the way to what today we call Israel. And you can see the trace of the journey on the map. You know, first they went north. Apparently they wanted to be close to the rivers and close to what was then still civilization, so to speak, and away from the Jordan Syrian desert. And then they turn around in Haran after they live in Haran for several years. And they go through Mount Hermon, where the Brit Ben Abtarim took place. Only about a year ago, I figured out that the name Hermon came from Cherem. And I figured it out because I do a lot of mountain biking in the Judea desert, and we ride around in the Judea desert. There's another mountain called Jabal Harmun. So I looked up why Jabal Harmun was called Harmun, and indeed it was called so after the word Cherem. So there's no wonder that Cherem, Brit Ben Abtarim, all these things are connected. And then finally, Abraham ends up first in Beersheba and all sorts of other places in what today we call Israel. And so this is an incredible journey, an incredible migration. And just to bring it home a little bit, I decided to share with you a small snippet, a small video from this wonderful movie called Revolutionary Road, starring by Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. And this movie was made after a book by the same name, I think, written by Richard Yates. And Richard Yates is an American author who specializes in what can be called suburban depression. And he writes novels about life in American suburbia. And in this book, in this novel, he described a couple where the man, Leonardo DiCaprio, works in Manhattan in a huge company, which should be IBM, but they don't call it IBM. And he works there because his father worked there before. He's a manager. He hates his job. His job is very boring and monotone. And every day he goes to work, every day he comes back from work, and he doesn't enjoy life, or at least doesn't enjoy his work at all. At the same time, his wife, who is a homemaker, begins to fantasize about doing something else, about changing their life. And she finds a job without telling him. So she finds a job in Paris, France, as an interpreter. And she decides that for the sake of their marriage and for their life, they should leave Long Island. They should leave suburbia behind and move to France. So here's a little clip in which she tells him about this decision.
Shimon, we can't hear the audio. When you share, you need to click on.
Okay, I understand that you couldn't see it?
No, we can see it, but we can't hear the audio. So when you do your screen share, you need to click the button, share my computer audio.
Okay, hold on a minute. So I'm currently sharing, and
so stop sharing and reshare it again with, yeah.
okay. And now I share.
And there's a button there to
Right.
share
Okay.
with audio, yeah.
Thank you.
So why don't we go there?
You're serious?
Yes. What's stopping us?
What's stopping us? Well, I could think of a number of different. For example, what kind of a job could I possibly get?
You won't be getting any kind of a job. Because I will.
Oh, right.
Don't laugh at me. Listen a minute. Do you know what they pay for secretarial positions in government agencies in Europe?
No, I don't.
Listen, Frank, I'm serious about this. Do you think I'm kidding her?
I just have a couple of questions is all. For one thing, what exactly am I supposed to be doing while you're out earning all this money?
But don't you see? That's the whole idea. You'll be doing what you should have been able to do 7 years ago. You'll have time. For the first time in your life, you'll have time to find out what it is that you actually want to do. And when you figure it out, you'll have the time, the freedom to start doing it.
It's not very realistic is all.
No, Frank. This is what's unrealistic. It's unrealistic for a man with a fine mind to go on working year he can't stand, coming home to a place he can't stand, to a wife who's equally unable to say the same things. Do you know the worst part? Our whole existence here is based on this great premise that we're special and superior.
Okay, I decided to wait because it's quite torturous to see it in video, I think.
To the whole thing.
So let me
But we're not.
move to the next slide. Basically, you know, if you have a chance, I highly recommend this movie. And the issues in this movie is focus on what you see here. It's the interplay of stagnation versus change, of fatalistic way of thought, going every day to the same routine because that's what we are destined to do, versus free will and enterprise and going boldly into the unknown. It's also about different cultures of suburbia, resident life, and emigrant, and moving into a new culture, a new city, a new country, a new life, which is so typical of Judaism, I think. And so it's interesting that in a very different culture, very different point of time, we see exactly the same sort of set of issues that characterize some of the greatest migrations, began by Abraham and later on by other great Jewish leaders. And so, Gil, can you remember to mute all every once in a while? Thank you. So here's a little rock in one of my rides near Sde Boker. And the innovation that we see here is that Judaism becomes a legacy of nomadic wandering. And the great breakthroughs in Judaism occur not in fixed locations, but rather in the transitions from one location to another. So in the case of Abraham, Judaism is invented on the trip from Ur to the land of Canaan. And then Jacob moves from Canaan to Egypt. And then Moses leads the Exodus from Egypt to Israel, during which trip the 10 commandments are given to the Jewish people. And so Judaism, as we know it, is formed on the move. always on the move. So it's always a result of exploration of new places and new ideas. So let me fast forward to the Moses Exodus led by Moses from Egypt. And here are some images of Moses by different artists. And it's interesting to see the difference between the Christian interpretation of Moses and the Jewish interpretation of Moses that we see on the left. In almost all Christian paintings and sculpture, Moses is portrayed as some sort of a Superman. And in the Jewish paintings, he looks more like a Nebuch. Which actually he was a kind of a Nebuch. He was an Egyptian prince by coincidence, although he was born Jewish. And just like Abraham, he was, very well settled and prosperous. He had a wonderful life in the Egyptian court. And yet, unlike Abraham, who was sort of a Sumerian Odysseus, Moses was the humblest man on earth. He was, he thought very little of himself. He suffered from stuttering, gimgum. He had no charisma whatsoever, or at least that's what he thought. He was a very quiet person. And when God asks him to lead the people of Israel back to their homeland, Moses refuses, and he says, I'm unfit for the job. You have to look for a better leader. And then basically God has to convince him that he should take the job. And finally Moses agrees and becomes the leader that we know him today. But he basically is a very strange choice for a leader. And as you well know, the Ten Commandments, sort of the major event in the Exodus from Egypt to the land of Canaan, was given in Mount Sinai, a place in which I visited several times, and I climbed Mount Sinai several times. And this is a very remote, desolate, and forbidding place. And it makes a lot of sense that God will reveal himself to Moses in such a place. Because in a place like Mount Sinai, which is so desolate and remote, first of all, there is a feeling of presence. You feel that there's something present there, and you cannot put your finger on it. And if anything is present, it must be some form of a God. And so it's a very natural place of revelation, and this is where God can reveal himself or herself to a human being in a place which is completely devoid of life, of any social filters, any cultural filters, of which there were many in Egypt. So you have to go into a complete emptiness in order to start, something so dramatically new. So it is at the top of Mount Sinai, the top of this mountain, that God gives Moses the Ten Commandments. And of course, while this happens, by the way, this is a picture of one of the Qumran scrolls, in which you can literally read the Ten Commandments at the bottom left. This is about 2,300 years ago, and so this is a very old set of rules, and it's also very clear. The Ten Commandments are extremely clear, concise, easy to recall, easy to understand, beyond dispute. They are either negative or positive. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you should do this, you should do that. It turns out that 4 commandments speak about the relationship of man with God, and the remaining 6 commandments speak about the relationship between man and man. So most of the commandments deal with social justice, and they become a universal standard for orderly life. And if you remove the 10 commandments, you have chaos. If you abide to the 10 commandments, you have the beginning of civilization. And the contract is, I will be your God, you will be my people, as long as you live by these 10 rules. And circumcision, is believed to be, some sort of form of signing this contract, or some physical mark of willing to take upon yourself the 10 commandments. And there are numerous innovations in the 10 commandments. First of all, the clarity is striking, because the gods of the ancients before Judaism were extremely mysterious, and the priests did not want to explain what the strange gods did, because it was in the benefit of the priests to act as sort of a go-between that can interpret what God is trying to do. But not in Judaism. In Judaism, it's very clear what God wants you to do. And it's also, very innovative that most of what God tells you deals with social justice, and not with ceremonies and mezuzot and so on. None of this can be found in the 10 Commandments. It's mostly about how to live daily life. It puts a great focus on the here and now. There's no promise of eternal life. There's no promise that if you behave in a certain way now, you will go to paradise or something like this in the after death. Not at all. The whole idea is that virtue is its own reward, and your fate is in your hand. You're not governed anymore by some capricious gods that decide unpredictably to punish you. There's always a reason, and almost always the reason is because you misbehave. So your fate is in your hand. All these things were extremely innovative and new compared to the paganic cultures in which background they evolved. And also the fact that everything was written and documented is extremely important, of course. Now, as you remember from your Bible, while Moses goes up to get the Torah, the 10 Commandments, the Israelites begin a great festival down at the bottom of the mountain, and they erect a monument for the Baal, one of the paganic gods, and the golden calf, Egel HaZahav, and they dance around it, and they feast, and they have sex, and there's a whole orgy or a sort of a bakchanalia going on down at the bottom of the mountain. And you can see it at the left of the picture. You can see Moses throwing the tablets, the 10 Commandments, on the floor and breaking them, and because he's completely upset from this setback of the Israelites. And throughout the Bible, we see the tension of the Jewish God vis-a-vis the paganic gods, the Baal, Ashtoret, because back then a lot of people believed both in the Jewish God and in the paganic God, just to be on the safe side. And there were a great deal of sort of dynamics between these different beliefs. And so God becomes also extremely annoyed by the behavior of the Israelites, and he wants to destroy all these people that Moses led from Egypt to Mount Sinai, and he promises Abraham that he will start a new nation, a new people from his seed. So God says, let's get rid of this, bunch of bandits and start something new. And then Moses begins to argue with God. And he says, for what reasons, God, should your anger flare out against your people who you brought out from the land of Egypt with great power, with a strong hand? For what reason should the Egyptians say, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains, to destroy them from the face of the soil? So Moses tells God that he's going to suffer a public relation setback here. And then Moses advises God, turn away from your flaming anger. Be sorry for the evil intended against your people. Recall Abraham, Yitzhak, and Israel, Yaakov, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself when you spoke to them, I will make your seed many as the stars in the heaven. And all this land which I have promised, I will give to your seed, and they may inherit it, for all the ages. And the happy end is that God let himself be sorry concerning the evil that he had spoken of doing to his people. So what we see here is a wonderful example of what I call the interactive God. One is welcome to reason with God, to doubt what God says, to ask questions, and even to manage to change God's mind. So the interaction with God doesn't take place in ceremonies or in the temple or in the pyramids or in the ziggurats in Mesopotamia. The dialogue with God can happen anywhere. It can happen on a mountain, it can happen in a desert, it can happen in the middle of the sea. And the whole idea is that God is not only interactive, God is also portable. God is something that you carry within. You carry it with you anywhere you go. Now this abstract and invisible frame of God is extremely modern. It's the first time in history, as we know it, in which God is an abstract entity. It is so abstract that one of the rules of God is that you're not allowed to create any sculpture or painting in the form of God. Because once again, God is an idea. God is a spirit. It's a spiritual experience. It's not a concrete or a physical experience. Now, I suppose that a great deal of this happened because the Jews were people on the move. They were nomads. And so they never attached themselves to a single location. They never attached themselves to a single god or to a single idol. So their whole form of identity had to evolve during their wanderings. And therefore, they were led to create, once again, a completely abstract and invisible way of thinking about God, about divine intervention. So let's fast forward to King David, and now we are about 1,000 years before Christ. And of course, the most famous chapter in King David's career was the duel with Goliath. And let me remind you a little bit of the background. So the Plishtim are located in what today we call Tel Azekah, in the valley of Elah, Emek Elah. And the Jews, the Israelites who fight against the Plishtim, are located in what today we call Har Sokah. I know these places very well because I ride there all the time with my mountain bikes. and down between Mount Soka and Tel Azeka, there is a great valley. And this is where Goliath, the strongest warrior of the Plishtim, goes down every morning. And every morning he goes through his regular trash talk, and he curses and offends the Jewish people and challenge them to fight with him. And all the Jews are afraid to fight Goliath, as you know well from the Song of Kaveret. And then there are two Jewish warriors, Eliav, and I forgot the name of his brother, who were the sons of Ishai. And they are in the Jewish army. And Ishai sends David, who was a very young kid, to bring food and chavilot and chuparim to his two brothers located in Mount Sukkah. So David comes over. David was a shepherd. He makes the trip to Har Sukkah. He sees this giant standing down in the valley and trash talking the Jewish people, and then he decides to fight against him. And the rest, of course, is history. And before the fight, David tells Goliath, "You come to me with swords and with spears, but I come to you in the name of God. Today, God will deliver you into my hand. I shall kill you and give you a corpse and the corpse of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild beasts, so that the whole world may know that there is a God in Israel, and that God does not give victory by means of sword and spear, for God is Lord of the battle, and he will deliver you into my power." I just want you to notice the great translation by Everett Fox. And this is, one of the greatest moments in history. And what is so great about it is, first of all, this notion of the underdog that comes from complete obscurity. He's just a shepherd. He's just a teenager. We don't see things like this in the Greek culture. We never see things like this in Egyptian and Sumerian cultures, where all the heroes are always princes, kings, princesses, barons, and so on. Here we see someone who comes out, from the goats and the sheep, and becomes, the most heroic figure in his period. And so this is a second example in which God selects his leaders in a very strange way. It's sort of an equal opportunity situation. So with Moses, he selected a stutterer. With David, he selects a kid who was a shepherd. And it's possible because God is abstract and his power is abstract. It's not the power of the sword. It's not the power of the mighty, the rich, the connected. It's a spiritual power. And the beautiful thing about spiritual power is that we all have spirits. So every one of us can be endowed and can be touched by God, by divine intervention. And so this is the first time in Western civilization, as we now call it, where the outcast, the underdog, becomes the powerless, becomes the hero. And we see it also, if I can fast forward to American culture. Why do you think Huckleberry Finn is such an important book? Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. It's a terribly important book because it's the first novel in which the hero is a kid, is an orphan, a homeless kid. And the second hero is a runaway slave. And, people could not believe that an author will devote himself to write, such a long, well, not terribly long, but such a major novel about, two anti-heroes like this. And this was the beginning of, a completely new period, literary period, in which authors allowed themselves to write about any character, and not necessarily about kings, queens, dukes, and so on, which was so customary before Huckleberry Finn and before David, back then. So once again, there's a great sort of social virtue and a social innovation in the story of David and Goliath. But David was also a sinner. And once he becomes God, by the way, another interesting fact about David was that he was either son or grandson of Ruth a Moaviah, who I think wasn't even Jewish. It's another interesting point, but that's sort of a side anecdote. But David was a sinner, and he committed a very serious sin because, in one of the cool evenings in Jerusalem, he stands at his balcony and he sees a beautiful woman taking a bath on one of the roofs. And he finds out that this was Bathsheba, who was the wife of one of his generals, Uriah Hitti. And so he has an affair with Bathsheba. And in order to make it more easy to manage, he arranges for her husband. He doesn't really arrange him to get killed, but he sends him to a very dangerous mission far away from Jerusalem, and then Uriah Hitti gets killed in the process. And then King David marries Bathsheba, and he thinks that he's going to live happily ever after. But Nathan, who was the official priest of the King David court, comes to see David, and he tells him this story, which today we call Kivsat Arash in Hebrew. In the same town, there were two men, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had flocks and herds in great abundance. The poor man had nothing but a lamb, only a single little one which he had bought. He fostered it and grew it up with him and his children, eating his bread, drinking from his cup, sleeping in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. When a traveler came to stay, the rich man did not take anything from his own flock or herd to provide for the wayfarer who had come to him. Instead, he stole the poor man's lamb, his cherished possession, and prepared it for his guest. So when King David hears the story, he becomes extremely angry, and he demands to know who is this criminal. And Nathan tells him, "You are that man. You are the criminal." And from this parable, mashal, King David finally understands the extent of his sin. He acknowledges it and he begs God for mercy. And you see, that's another reason why it is so easy for us to connect with David. And that is because he's such a humane and round character. On the one hand, he is king of Israel, the builder of an empire, the hero from Emek Ha'elah. But on the other hand, he's a sinner. He's also, lighthearted. He dances naked as an honor to God. He maintains the free spirit of the shepherd, even though by now he's already God. Is king, revered as God, actually. And surprisingly enough, he's also, according to tradition, he's also a great poet. And, according to tradition, a great deal of Sefer Mishlei was written by David. And we find there, wonderful stanzas like, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me under the shadow of your wings. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? For I am a stranger with you and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. As the deer goes after the water brooks, so my soul seeks you. And another example is, the Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still water. He restores my soul. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, the special thing about this kind of poetry is that, unlike, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, what we see here is a great emphasis of the self. David talks about himself, his fears, his depression, his moods, the ups and downs, his despair, his yearning for advice, his ignorance, his confusion. And this is the first time, in at least in ancient literature, where we find such a strong focus on the self, on the voice of consciousness. And once again, it's a dialogue with an inward God, with a God which, is somewhere inside your personality, inside yourself. And this is, the beginning of a new exploration, the exploration of oneself, which once again is profoundly psychological. And, you don't find Odysseus or Achilles or Agamemnon, communicating such moments of grief and uncertainty. So that's another great innovation, the focus on one's self, the focus on one's vices and weaknesses. And, the prophet, Nathan was not exactly a prophet, he was more of an official priest. But when Nathan tells David the story of the lamb, at some point he tells him, you're going to live by the sword. As a punishment, you're going to live by the sword. And indeed, what happens is that David creates this little empire that we see here. And his son, King Solomon, or Melech Shlomo, builds the empire, extends it. He builds the temple in Jerusalem. But, this construction has terrible social implications because it involves a great deal of taxes and forced labor. And the son of Shlomo, Rehoboam, continues the taxation, continues the tyranny. And when the people of Israel complain, he comes up with this, incredible sentence, my father flogged you with a lash, and I will whip you with scorpions. So, this is a great example of what normally happens. When the first generation, the innovators, have a tremendous energy, positive energy, and then this energy is spoiled by the second generation, which becomes corrupt and full of hubris. And then comes a third generation, which acts with complete stupidity and ruins everything. And we see it, all over history. And the end, of this saga is that around 1,000 years before Christ, the empire, the Davidic Empire, splits into two kingdoms, Israel and Judea. And so we get from a formidable and powerful empire, we get two small nations, which are easy to defeat if one wants to do so. And so this brings me to my last chapter, to the age of the prophets. And this is about 500 years BC. And once again, the kings are arrogant, the priests are corrupt, Baal worship is on the rise, and human sacrifice is on the rise. By the way, you may know the terms חקלאות בעל וחקלאות שלחים. חקלאות בעל, Baal agriculture, means that you don't have to irrigate. You rely on rains. And it's called Baal because what you have to do is bring sacrifice and worship your gods, and then they will send you rain. And the alternative is to irrigate, and then you don't need God to help you because you take your fate in your own hands. But back then, once again, the Israelites, led by Rehoboam himself, King Rehoboam, begin to worship the Baal, and they build temples for the Baal and for his wife Ashtoret, another paganic goddess. And so God decides that he's not going to speak anymore through the mainstream leadership. Before this era, there were kings, there were priests, and the power of God went through the kings, through the priests, to the commoner, to the common people. Now, that's what happened in the paganic cultures, and that's what happened to a certain extent during the time of David and King Solomon. But now that when everything is corrupt, when everything is breaking down socially, God decides that other people, completely other type of people, are going to represent him in the real world, so to speak. And these representatives are very strange characters coming from nowhere, and they become the new agents of God. And in this picture here, obviously a modern rendition of a very famous episode in the Bible, we see King Ahab, son of Rehoboam, I think, and his wife Isabel, who was a Phoenician princess. And they are encountered by this strange character, this homeless, ragged person who comes out of nowhere, who was the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi. And this happened somewhere in Mount Carmel. And here we see the interplay, between the power of the king and the queen and this prophet who comes from nowhere. And not only King Ahab worships the Baal, he even sacrifices his own children to the Baal. And that back then, the whole culture of the paganic culture was based on sacrifice, human sacrifice and sacrifice of animals. And if you wanted a great favor from God, you had to sacrifice something or someone who was very close to your heart. So people would sacrifice their children. And not only in Judaism, also in Christianity, we see that some of the greatest figures, both in Judaism and in Christianity, fought against human sacrifice. For example, in Christianity, Saint Patrick, the official saint of the Irish people, is most known for abolishing human sacrifice and the sacrifice of animals in Ireland. This was his major achievement. And up until today, when St. Patrick's Day is celebrated in New York City, where there are more Irish people than anywhere else, the major color is green. And that's because before St. Patrick, the major color was red, the color of blood. That's how people, presented their devotion to God, by spilling blood. And yet St. Patrick talked, that sort of spoke and tried to evangelize the notion of going to the outdoor, going to the wild, spending time in remote locations, going out to personal exile in places of nature. And therefore it became sort of the green sacrifice rather than the red sacrifice. And so here, the prophet Eliyahu speaks against Ahab, against the culture of the sacrifice and the terrible waste of human life and the life of animals. And then he's persecuted by Ahab and Isabel. In particular, Isabel, spends all her time, going after the prophets and killing as many prophets as she could. And at some point, Eliyahu becomes the last prophet that survives, and he hides in a cave somewhere on Mount Carmel, around what we call today the Muhraka. And you see a picture of the Muhraka here. And there's a very famous episode from the Bible where it is described how Eliyahu walks around, around the cave, and all of a sudden he has a revelation. God was walking by, says the Bible. A mighty hurricane split the mountains and shattered the rocks, but God was not in the hurricane. And after the hurricane, there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire, but God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. This was God, the small voice. So God is not in the special effects, and he is not in the elements. He's not in the fire, he's not in the water, not in the wind, not in the hurricane, not in the flood. God is a small voice which Eliyahu hears within himself. And as I said before, in the prevailing culture, God, or the power of God, the divine power, flowed through the kings, through the priests, to the common people. But according to the prophets, according to Eliyahu and other prophets, none of this was true God. No, true God was a spiritual power. It was an internal power. It came from within. And because it came from within, it was completely democratic. Anyone could hear the voice of God. You didn't have to be a priest. You didn't have to be connected. You didn't have to be in the temple. You didn't have to be in Jerusalem. You could meet God anywhere you wanted because you carried God within you. So this is such an abstract and sophisticated perception of God that it's very impressive that we see this once again on the backdrop of other cultures that existed back then. Because if we forget about these other cultures, we tend to take Judaism and the Bible for granted. We say, obviously, that's how things should have been all along. But in fact, this was not at all the mainstream. The mainstream was paganic. The mainstream was pyramids. The mainstream was the temple in Jerusalem and the ziggurats, the huge pyramids in what is now Iraq. This was the mainstream. And this was the innovation. What you see here, Eliyahu, the internal voice, the small voice, was the new startup, the new form of modern, modern understanding of what religion is all about. And it's also it's interesting that if God was anywhere in this episode, he was more in the wind, more than anything else. And it's interesting because when we think about the greatest sign of life, the greatest sign of life is being able to breathe, being able to take wind, air in and exhale it, let the wind go out. And this notion of neshama, neshima, neshama, this sort of forms the connection between, man and God. It's my neshama and the Spirit of God. Ruach HaKodesh. We say Ruach HaKodesh. Wind it's the only element which we can feel, but we cannot see. Okay, it's an abstract element. And that's why Ruach HaKodesh and not, the fire of the Kodesh or the hurricane of the Kodesh. It's Ruach. And it's a still voice, a small voice, a voice that you carry within. And the tradition of the prophets continues with many other heroes, like Amos was a shepherd coming from what today is called Tekoa, or back then it was also called Tekoa, a village which is about 10 kilometers south of Jerusalem. And you see here Amos standing and sort of overlooking the walls of Jerusalem, which back then was a seat of great corruption and worshiping the wrong gods. And Amos says, listen to this, you cows of Bashan. He says it sort of in a derogatory way, Parot Bashan. Living on the hills of Samaria, Shomron, exploiting the weak and ill-treating the poor, saying to your husbands, bring us drinks. The days will soon be on you when God will use hooks to drag you away through the breaches in the wall you will leave and be herded away towards Hermon, because it is from the north where trouble will begin. Always in the Jewish tradition, the trouble begins from the north. Although you have built houses, you will never live in them. Although you have planted vineyards, you will not drink their wine, for I know how many your crimes are and how outrageous your sins, your oppressors of the people and abusers of the poor. Now notice the great emphasis on social justice and the violation of social justice. And then Amos says, seek good and not evil, so that you may survive. You may survive. Let justice reign in the city gate. I hate your festivals. I take no pleasure in your assemblies. He talks against the temple. He talks about, again, the ceremonies in the temple. He talks about, in a way, he talks against all the idiots who want to build the temple today. Let justice reign in the city gate. I hate your festivals. I take no pleasure in your assemblies. When you bring me sacrifices, I do not accept them. Spare me the din of your chanting. I don't care about your prayers. Let me hear none of your strumming on lyres, but let justice flow like water and uprightness like a never failing stream. So Amos says the only thing that God cares about is social justice. And we know from Jewish tradition that, such rules as, there's a very famous story about Rabbi Akiva when he was asked, can you sum up the Torah in one sentence? He said, don't do to your friend what is hated by yourself. Al ta'aseh lechavrecha ma shesanu alecha. He said, that's all of the Torah. He said, on regel achat, in a nutshell. And that's exactly what Amos says. And, and parallel to Amos, roughly in the same time, we find the prophet Micha, who also speaks against the religious ceremonies. And he says, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000 rivers of oil? שומן שיוצא מהחיות שאתם מקריבים אותם? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? This idea that you can sacrifice your children in order to gain forgiveness from God. God has already shown you what is right and what he requires of you. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And once again, the great virtue here is that ceremonies and cathedrals and religious processions and crosses and all these physical symbols mean absolutely nothing to God. The only thing that matters is how you carry yourself, how you live. And if you want to serve God, you have to serve justice. That's what the prophets told us. Now you have to realize that these prophets came from nowhere. They were standing by the gates of the cities like homeless people today and preaching their speeches, mocked by children, ridiculed by the regular bourgeois. And these people became the greatest heroes of the Bible. The Bible devoted something like 12 books to these homeless people, to these prophets, to these shepherds from Tekoa, who came from nowhere. They had no nobility, no connections, no family. The only thing that distinguished them is what they said. And a great deal of the Bible is devoted to these people. So, once again, think about Huckleberry Finn, think about the underdog. Think about the strange ways in which God chooses his representatives, his medium, his mouthpiece. And you see, once again, that there's a great innovation here, that it's a very strong form of spiritual democracy. Anyone can be the agent of God. And the last prophet is Jeremiah, and he can be called the prophet of the last minute, sort of the last opportunity, because back then the enemies of Israel and Judea were already very near, and Jeremiah desperately tried to talk the people of Israel into, once again, adopting a life of justice. It says, amend your behavior and your actions, and I will let you stay in this place. If you treat one another fairly, if you do not exploit the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, now think about Mevakshei Miklat. If you don't exploit the stranger, if you do not shed innocent blood in this place, the temple, then I shall let you stay here in the country I gave to your ancestors. Of course, the Jewish people do not heed to this advice. And then in 721 BC, the Assyrian army descends on Israel, the northern part of what used to be the Davidic Empire, and crushes Samaria. And the 10 tribes are lost forever. And then about 150 years later, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, destroys Jerusalem, and then the southern kingdom is lost. And the diaspora begins, the Galut. And it will take another 2,000 years before the Jews will make a comeback. So I thought of ending this lecture with an anecdote, well, not an anecdote, but actually a very interesting narration that I found. And I called it, who is the rightful owner of the land of milk and honey? Which is, a very controversial and interesting question. And I found the answer. And it's a lovely answer. And I have to tell you how I found it. I had to teach a lecture about 2 years ago. I planned to give a lecture on a topic in computer science called compilation. And a great deal of compilation deals with parsing, something which in computer science we call parsing. So I went to the internet and I wrote parsing, and I was looking for some image of parsing to start my lecture about how to develop a parser. And then the first thing that came out was this page, which is the beginning of the Bible. And the reason it came out was because what you see at the bottom of the page, which today we call Perush Rashi, which is a leading interpretation, an extremely sophisticated and clever interpretation of the Bible. And Rashi is known, not only Rashi, but many Jewish scholars are known to read only 2 or 3 words from the Bible and then go on and on interpreting, debating, trying to understand what these words mean. And here, Rashi tries to explain why the Bible begins with Bereshit bara Elohim et haaretz. Why et haaretz? What is so special about haaretz? No, he could have said shamayim, mayim, but no. So Rashi says, לא היה צריך להתחיל את התורה. מה טעם פתח בראשית שנצטוו בה ישראל משום blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, as you know, I have to give you some background, that the land of Canaan was gained after some very cruel wars. And the Jews basically kicked out from the land of Canaan all the nations that lived here. The Chivi, the Prizi, the Girgashi. So, the formation of Eretz Israel was formed in sin, probably like the formation of all nations in history. But here Rashi says, שאם יאמרו אומות העולם לישראל, ליסטים אתם, ליסטים is bandits, gangsters, ליסטים אתם שכבשתם ארצות 7 גויים, הם אומרים להם, you should say, היהודים צריכים להגיד להם חזרה, כל הארץ של הקדוש ברוך הוא, the land belongs to God. The whole earth belongs to the Holy One. הוא נתנה לאשר ישר בעיניו. God decides who will own the land. ברצונו נתנה להם, וברצונו נטלה מהם ונתנה לנו. Okay? And in English, which is also available in this page, if the nations of the earth will say to Israel, "You're bandits, for you have conquered the lands of the 7 nations who inhabited Canaan," Israel, this is we're preparing a sort of a speech of defense, right? Israel will say to them, "The earth belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. It didn't belong to them. It belongs to God. He created it. And he gave it to the one found proper in his eyes. By his wish, he gave it to them. And by his wish, he took it from them and gave it to us." Okay? So this is a very sophisticated interpretation of who owns the country. It's not us. It's not the Palestinians. It's not any other concrete entity. It's God that owns the country, and God decides who should own it. But you will own it and you will reside in it only as long as you do justice in the eye of the God. And if you will not do justice, well, expect trouble. Because it doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs only to God. So it reminds me that, I once did a biking trip in Georgia. And someone told us a very nice parable. He said, a Georgian guy told us that, how does it go? That when God gave the countries to the different nations of the world, the Gruzinim, the Georgian people, were drunk because they overdrank in the previous night, and they didn't come to stand in line, so they got no country at all. And when they finally went out of the hangover, they woke up, they saw that everyone had a country, but they had nothing. And so they went to God and said, "Where's our country?" And God told them, "You missed the line. You didn't stand in line, so you got nothing, obviously. And you were drinking and feasting and dancing." So the Gruzian people told him, "God, we were feasting in your honor. We were dancing for you. It was all in your honor." So God said, "Well, in that case, I'm very impressed, and I will give you the country that I saved for myself." And then he gave them Georgia, which is a beautiful country. But that's the only thing that you find in Georgia, landscapes. He didn't give them anything else. Well, I shouldn't say this. At least in Christian in Christian history, Georgia is very important. I think it's the second, either the first or the second nation that adopted Christianity. Second. So to sum up, what do we see since Judaism went on the stage of history? We see the replacement of a fatalistic state of mind with self-determination, with a destiny which is controlled by your own actions. Instead of obedience, blind obedience, we see dialogue, we see interactive God. Instead of ceremonies and temples, we see a way of life which can be carried out anywhere. Instead of sacrifice, we see dedication. Instead of possessions and parot habashan, we see welfare, helping the stranger, helping the poor. Instead of external signs of worship, we see internal worship. And instead of physical symbols, we see spiritual and abstract notions of belief. And instead of a place, we see a state of mind. And it is this way of thinking which gave Jews the power to prevail in the diaspora, where they didn't need temples. They didn't need attachment to a particular land because everything was carried inside. And so divine justice is made by social justice, and anyone can be touched by the Spirit, by Ruach HaKodesh, and your fate is in your hands, which was a huge innovation. All right, so I think we'll separate now, and I'll see you next week in our last lecture.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
תודה שמעון.
Thank you,
תודה רבה.
Bye bye.
Thank you. תודה רבה.
Thank you.
האם אפשר בשבוע הבא לעשות את זה ברכיבה על אופניים?
האמת שההרצאה של שבוע הבא זה על אופניים, אז...
אני יודע, שזה אני אומר.
כן, אז אני חושב שנעשה את זה בזום, ואחרי זה אולי נעשה פולו-אפ על אופניים. אוקיי?
סגרנו.
אוקיי, חנן.
תודה רבה, שמעון.
ביי, בכיף.